We are so back, and today I'm going to be doing my literal biggest project yet. I don't think anyone has genuinely ranked every EToH tower from worst to best. It's something that I've wanted to do ever since I first started my channel, honestly, and I know this is going to be painfully difficult to rank, but I'm up for it. I will sort these towers into tiers, just to get a general idea of where we are at on the list. This is going to be a really long project, but one I'm actually looking forward to. So please please subscribe, as this is something I genuinely had to put so much into, more than ever before. And let me know which tower you think is the best / worst in the comments. Oh boy, here we go. Hope you enjoy this one. Let's get straight into it. Although, hang on. I'll also be including classic versions of towers, considering they once were canon in the game. As a side note, I'll do a ranking of all the non-canon content after this video, just so they get time in the spotlight too. But that's not going to be in this video, that's going to be a separate video after that. So if you want to see all the event towers and all the monthly towers and all that, I'll rank them separately, because, you know, some of them it's not fair to rank with the main content. So yeah, enjoy. This is going to be an absolute painful nightmare for me, but it's going to be, hopefully, a joy to watch. So yeah, enjoy. This is genuinely the worst experience ever created in the entire history of EToH. I genuinely don't know how anyone ever accepted this into the game. I mean, sure, standards were less back then, but this is the type of crap even the base play project would reject. The gameplay is absolute trash. It relies on ridiculously janky glitches and horrible far jumps. And let's not forget the thin studs. There's also a bunch of misalignments, and the tower just honestly looks awful. It deserves to be chucked in a dump truck, never to be seen again. If you enjoyed this, you either have nothing better to do, or you've gone clinically insane. This is the literal worst tower of all. Seriously, I just can't even compliment the idea of this tower. The gameplay is just so agonising that it would make me honestly start to cry. Horrible, horrible, terrible, atrocious tower. Yeah, I'm also including the neats here. They may as well be allowed to join in. Maybe a tower is literally a few jumps of bland, boring gameplay, and that's about it. It's harder than intended to be. It's literally done in 20 seconds. It looks really unsightly. How can you honestly rank this? It's just rubbish, let's be honest. I think we all know why this is just absolute pure garbage nonsense. There is literally no gameplay that isn't absolute spam within this tower. There's a ton of visible Z fighting, and this tower is one of the worst looking in the game. It's empty, terribly basic, and has an extremely unnecessary difficulty spike. There's no fun to be had here. You'll basically be suffering finicky, crappy gameplay, which is basically a repetition of the same kind of jump. Honestly, what is to love? There is nothing to love about this tower. It's horrible. You might think I'm being a bit too harsh on this tower, but I have my reasons. This was supposed to be one of the first impressions of the game when it was around, and instead it was filled with absolute garbage, and spam and uninspiring basic jumps, and that's literally about it. Floors 8 to 10 were literal walking simulator, and the tower was half yawn fest, half difficulty spike. The gameplay was pretty lackluster, nothing of note going on, and it dragged on for far too long for how empty it is. The tower comes across as lazy and boring, and that's just sad in my opinion. Do I even need to explain why this tower's just genuinely trash? I honestly hate the unindicated trap field, trashy, lazy mistake that this tower is. Don't even get me started on this, man. The tower's gameplay is honestly some of the worst I've ever seen. There's conveyor and kill brick spam everywhere. The entire tower has incredibly outdated gameplay, which is a pain to play, and all in all it just sucks. There's nothing interesting or noteworthy about this tower. Sure, it was the first SC, but unfortunately with that, the worst SC. Well, still in the game anyway. I don't think there's any enjoyment to get out of this tower, even if you've managed to beat it before. Like, it's just genuinely horrible. I am honestly surprised some people have committed to grind and beat this. I would never have managed to hold my sanity for that long. Another one in which I question how it even got into the game in the first place. This tower was one of the laziest out there and really poor in quality. There was nothing creative about it. All the jumps were poorly designed to the point where you could fail due to some stupid misalignment, and the gameplay was either clunky or just plain spam. It quite literally looks like it took 10 minutes to make this tower, and failing just felt horrible due to the fact that it probably wasn't even your fault. Trash tower, and honestly, I'm surprised it lasted as long as it did. This one is pretty similar to Matt in the sense that it's literally just a bunch of basic jumps in a 30-second obby with no real inspiration besides that. But this was the first mini tower in the game, and it also has this weird texture for the jumps. Looks awful though. A boring mini tower which is literally 30 seconds of your life you'll never get back. The stakes are a little higher in this one, I guess, because you're going over an outside, and it's used in EToH, so it's just as bad quality as Matt, but at least it has something, I suppose. I will always remember this as the tower that went from being a mediocre experience to absolutely obvious lazy spam garbage. Best of both worlds, obviously. The tower looks like it tried to be cool, but halfway through the creator just couldn't be asked anymore and just spammed a bunch of crap and hoped for the best. It wasn't even that great beforehand. It had a healing simulator, 2 of them, great stuff, cheers for that mate. And the design of the gameplay looked really off at some points. It was boring, painful to play through, and just all round sucked. This tower was the dictionary definition of boredom. It had some of the most bland, uninspiring, and lazy gameplay, and it just spammed it for 10 floors. The 10th floor having a very large difficulty spike for some odd reason. I seriously don't know what Itnir thought he was doing here. Floor 4 is literally just walking. I fall asleep just playing it. The jumps are misaligned and placed poorly. The places where the tower tries to be slightly unique fail miserably due to the gameplay being awful. And the tower just wasn't good at all. It was awkward, and I imagine even someone with this skill level would find it horrible to play. The old TOL was actually one of the most unplayable things in the game. Not necessarily the tightrope's fault, it was just the fact that all the jumps that involved them were placed so stupidly you could sometimes fall due to the weird placement of another jump, which was just stupid. I know this tower was made as a joke, but still it's trash and I'm gonna make it known. I guess the idea was kinda out there though. Respect for actually going through with it. Shame we got a tower like, well, this, but that was kind of bound to happen at this point in the game's lifespan. The last 2 floors are so ridiculous in terms of how much they ramp up the difficulty, and that one tightrope over 1 was a good idea but unnecessary. It spanned basic jumps with a few annoying kill bricks, and each non-tightrope jump felt like just the same old thing. Unplayable, next. The tower, which is commonly known for causing what is said on the acronym, Tower of Despair, is just so scuffed. While it did have some creative ideas, the gameplay that was used to fill those ideas was so poor that it just defeated any prospects this tower had of maybe being up in F tier and not F-. The gameplay is really low quality. There are so many visible misalignments and Z-fighting, and all jumps just feel really poorly crafted, or purposely made as janky as possible. I've had so many fails purely over my Roblox physics just not being able to cope with the BS, which just annoyed me beyond belief. The gradient is also really ugly, it's just too bright and the colours don't work well together. Awful tower, enough said really, there's nothing else to really say, it's awful. Quite honestly, I was conflicted about where to put this tower, but I think it just belongs in F- tier. This tower is one that honestly just tried to be as creative as possible, but ended up being as annoying and unplayable as possible. The gameplay here is absolutely awful. It's clear they tried too hard with only limited client object ball knowledge, and the whole tower is just really tacky. It looks bad, the gameplay doesn't flow, it's ridiculously unsight readable, and is all around just rage bait. It's not even worthy of getting out of the bottom tier. It's the biggest fail I've ever seen from a tower that is clearly so ambitious, and it just comes across as a tower that's trying to piss you off more than a tower that's actually trying to be unique. This is honestly a horrible experience for anyone going in blind to this. First off, the tower is designed so weirdly that it looks like something that was made as a joke. The Hat in Time reference is nice, but it doesn't excuse the fact that this tower is for the most part literally unplayable. Wall hops just don't have a place in towers of this kind of difficulty, and it's concerning that they're put here, to be honest. It's really unfun due to constantly either being confused on where to go due to the constant multiple path, or just unsight readable areas, or by falling due to some clunky jump. It's an awful tower that I'm genuinely surprised has not had a revamp, because it really needs one. This tower is considered the worst in the game by a lot of people. In my opinion, that's a little harsh, as it clearly tried to do things that were somewhat unique, but in terms of gameplay, it's understandable that people hate this with a passion. The tower's ridiculously keen on thin studs, I don't really know why, but then again, guess it was trendy back in the day. The gradient is pretty ugly and the jumps just don't flow well with one another. Sure, the frame is wacky, but they don't really try anything to make this stand out, and the whole thing comes across as poorly made, and due to the low quality gameplay and high amount of soft locks, it's really unenjoyable, and I imagine grinding this would be a pain. Wow, this tower sucks, didn't it? While I somewhat respected it for trying to be out there with its ideas, the tower was awful to play through and the traps were just so frustrating. The tower's creativity wasn't really that high, but you could tell it was trying to do something different, that's why it isn't in F- tier. However, the gameplay is just so bad and the traps are placed in areas they're just not necessary in, and it's literally impossible without a guide to do this. It didn't really fit Zone 1, it felt like a chore to play and was overall awfully unenjoyable. It also focused on glitchy and crappy mechanics, and the lighting on floor 1 is just... I mean, what are they doing? The old TOA was known for being so bland and boring that it would put you to sleep. I never liked having to revisit the tower and always thought it was a chore to have to do, even for beginners. It's really basic, the whole thing feels like a walking simulator and that's not a good thing. All the jumps feel like the same, and floors 9 and 10 are literally free. You could tell the creator just given up at this point. There's unnecessary safety nets everywhere, and it feels like there's just no stakes involved. It's so boring, that's all I have to say. Like, describe this tower in one word, it would be boring. So, the old Toast wasn't exactly known for being a great tutorial to the game. For starters, it taught you mechanics that weren't going to last you past Ring 6, and it was really outdated. It also contained a lot of gameplay that would just never really be used that much, and it came across as overall useless after the year 2020. Beginners were losing it over this tower and quitting the game, and it didn't give a great impression of what was to come. However, I can say that at least they tried to give people a tutorial, and it does teach the basic jumps, but other than that, it just really sucks. This tower was never a whole lot of fun, however it's up here due to the creative concept. The tower itself sucked though. The traps were endless and the tower was cruel to the player in terms of where they were placed and how they could ruin your run if you were caught on one in the outside. While it was one of the first to use certain client objects and it did do creative stuff, the gameplay was awful and the tower was impossible to play through without a guide. It ended up sucking despite having the ideas and the resources to achieve them, which, in my opinion, makes it a fail. Oh my goodness, this one is bad. All the jumps are really finicky and this tower is just alarmingly empty and has a really soulless feeling to it. There is a known soft lock, the pear looking jumps are horrible to time, and the tower spikes up in difficulty for no reason, creating a really negative experience. I get that it tried to be short and snappy, but it just came across as lazy and uninspired, especially with the constant spammed gameplay this tower has. It's clunky, it's bad, and it just doesn't work. Although, to be fair, the gradient does look kinda nice, but that's just irrelevant. This was honestly such a boring and repetitive tower, and it didn't really have anything going for it besides being just another walking simulator with the occasional difficulty spike. It didn't really feel relaxing, it just felt boring, and the jumps were poorly made and inconsistent. It was forgettable, and when it was revisited, just felt like a chore to do. So yeah, I think it belongs right down here in F tier, although I will admit the music is kind of relaxing. That's something it's got going for it, I'd imagine. This tower is an example of walking simulator which is forgettable and kind of spammy for a tower made this far into the game's lifespan. It is really boring and has no interesting gameplay besides ridiculously easy walking that anyone could do eyes closed. It is better made than some of the more classic towers on the list, and that does show, but still they make an experience which is unfun, really unappealing, and just overall a letdown for Forgotten Ridge when the expectations at that point would have been much higher than something like this. So yeah, it's a fail. This tower was an absolute horrible experience back when it was in its early days. The gameplay was just absolutely terrible. The tower felt empty and there was just a bunch of two-stud wraparound spam. Seriously, this was absolutely ridiculous. The tower was bland, repetitive, and lacked any elements of good classic gameplay that the later version would go on to have. That said, it did inspire the good one we have today though. And you can clearly see where that would end up. It was just, obviously in its early days. I think of this tower more as a prototype for what Deep Silent wanted to be. And eventually, it's obvious that it would develop into a very good thing. So that's why it's in F tier. While it's relatively simple and some ideas are pretty interesting, the way this tower plays is anything but interesting. It's terrible in terms of gameplay, it makes you walk over kill bricks and it has a maze in which you literally just have to keep walking in random directions, hoping that you would eventually find the way out. You even have to walk around the frame on the last jump because no way you're doing that momentum X pusher, you're going to lose all your progress. Otherwise, the jumps are janky, the tower's kind of unsight readable and has a lot of random unnecessary traps. It's a really good example of a bad classic tower and there's not really that much else to say about it besides the fact that it's just not very good. This tower is quite a boring and repetitive one, and you can tell that it was made carelessly and quite rushed. There's a lot of gameplay that's really outdated and the tower isn't prone to the odd difficulty spike here and there, which makes the experience a tad painful to be honest. The tightropes are also unnecessarily thin, and forcing truss slicks is a good idea, but these ladders are really misaligned and just don't really work very well. It's a tower which was fine for its time, but now it just needs a revamp because it honestly, at the moment, is just... yeah, it's not good enough in terms of the quality of other stuff in this ring. This tower is definitely a nightmare in one way or another. This tower, just like EToH, constantly spams tight ropes and thin studs across the tower, and it has gameplay that's overall just really inconsistent and poorly made. The punishment is good, but honestly feels really unfair at a lot of points due to how much stuff you can fail at thanks to Roblox physics. There's thankfully a lot of skips, but this in turn just proves that not much care or effort went into this tower for them to make it more playable, so therefore it just kinda sucks. And also, I want to mention that the difficulty is just really, really inconsistent, and I know it's an old tower, but still, that's just terrible. Yeah, you might be thinking this is really low on the list, but I hate just how unsight readable this steeple is, and it quite frankly feels like you have to calculate every jump before doing it. The gameplay just isn't enjoyable. While it has a really cool finale and it tries to utilise a lot of mechanics, it fails tremendously at actually optimising these or making any of these fun, and the tower feels overall awful to play through if you go in blind. Yes, it's impossible without a guide unless you're a patient person, of which I am not. The whole different rooms idea is okay, but the tower just plays so poorly that I don't think it can be redeemed by this. And honestly, I'm so surprised that they didn't go through and try and revamp this, because Arcane Area had quite a few revamps, and this Steeples for some reason didn't get one, and it was probably the one that was most in need of it. I honestly don't even know what this tower was even about, to be honest. It's like someone just made a recreation of Tower of Heck and just put it into a tower with no real thought. It's not really mirrored either. It's just EToH, but its gameplay is slightly worse and more annoying than usual. This tower's pretty empty, it hasn't really got any sense of direction, and it overall just feels really unnecessary in my opinion. Like, I don't know why they made this. It doesn't resemble anything that remotely similar to EToH, besides, like, you know, some gameplay being kind of taken from it, and the slides don't work either. So, like, what even is going on here? I don't know if that's just a bug of mine or if it genuinely doesn't work, but come on, like, this was bad. While this Citadel had a cool concept, when it came to executing that, it failed miserably. It basically just took random floors from towers located in rings 1 to 3 and placed them randomly stacked together in one giant citadel. They changed some of the gameplay, but it often just felt out of place and forced in. Because the floors were stacked together completely randomly, they just don't flow well and the transitions between them feel awkward and uncomfortable. Overall, this Citadel was a huge failure, which was painful to beat due to the just horrible pacing, and the idea was cool in theory, but it just doesn't work unless you're gonna add, like, your own spin to it and make it actually work, if you know what I mean. Because they did try to put some of their own, like, stuff in the floors, but like I said before, it just didn't work and it felt awkward. This tower has really terrible gameplay which tries its best to look cool, which it does in some cases, but never tries to actually play very well. The ball jumps are as clunky as ball jumps usually are, and a lot of stuff just wasn't crafted well to actually work and feel like it flows. The outsides are cruel and nasty to play through, with a lot of unnecessary punishment throughout the tower. While admittedly it looks cool from a glance, when you play, you will realise it's basically just hell. Unless, of course, you're an absolute sadist who loves stuff like this. Yes, I did take into consideration that this was the first tower ever to use the dissension format, and for the theme it actually doesn't do a terrible job, but playing this now is absolutely a bad experience. I hate how claustrophobic you feel in this tower. It's really densely packed in a lot of places and the gameplay represents that. There's a lot of unnecessary traps, a bunch of killbrick spam, and even a maze with a giant killbrick spinner chasing you, which can be really demotivating if you happen to die there, as you can imagine. Also the soft locks. There is just no need. Well, like, why do we need soft locks in a challenging tower? This is a tower whose age shows quite a bit, sadly. But still, it tried hard to be unique, and it did sort of pull that off, so props to this tower, I suppose. This tower is one that is just so weirdly themed in my opinion, but it is so incredibly unsight readable and poorly made that it has to be low on the list. The puzzles are creative, especially for the time, but they're just so unindicated that you have no clue what you're supposed to do, and I think it's impossible without the help of a guide. When it isn't ridiculously confusing, it's annoying. The gameplay, especially on the later floors, can be really janky, and you can fall a lot of times and it not end up being your fault. If it isn't that, it's just really boring, with a large amount of jumps that are just glorified walking. Surprisingly clever design, I'll give it that, but terrible to play through. This tower is just poorly made in my opinion. While it does have some okay ideas here and there, most of it is just really bland and the gameplay is for some reason quite clunky. There's only one thing interesting about it, and that's the acronym. There's a spam of X bouncers, kill bricks, and falling platforms, and I feel like this one just overuses traps that are really obvious, and it kind of makes the tower look ugly and also just played strangely. It's not horrendously bad, but it definitely still sucks a little bit, and it's one of the factors that contribute to Ring 3 being kind of, well, bad. This steeple was honestly just a confusing mess, really. It's one of those steeples which heavily focused on design over gameplay, and it shows considering the gameplay is incredibly bad here. Design is actually cool, and the whole lore stuff is interesting too, just the overall experience totally sucks, and they don't even try to hide it. It's memorable, but for being bad. They just spam a bunch of stuff which is insanely difficult to sight read, and the steeple's unfun because of it. Difficulty's inconsistent, and this steeple was a bit of a letdown, to be honest. This tower is really unfun to play through. It is just so boring and confusing, and it's just painful to play in my opinion. There's an overusage of push boxes too, and they just aren't fun to play through for anyone. All the client objects are really unsight readable, and it's really hard to make any sense out of it unless you happen to have a guide on you. It also drags on for way too long, making for a hugely monotonous tower. It tried to be cool, but just became annoying, and there's no real fun to be had here. This tower is another one with some really questionable gameplay which kind of ruins the experience for me. While yes, the tower is quite creative in some areas, the way it executes this is not so good. There's a lot of parts that are just filler, and the parts that are memorable are usually the parts that were really bad. Floor 9 especially, with all the awkward jumps on the outside. Let's be honest though, the seat gameplay is the real thing weighing this tower down. It just doesn't work, and it makes really awkward gameplay that just isn't fun to play through. Just like with the other neats discussed so far, there's really nothing all that special about this tower, although it is a lot more fun to play than the other neats. There's just a lot of really questionable gameplay, and the jumps are quite awkward to make. It's definitely much longer though, and it actually feels a little more rewarding to beat. Still can't put it too high though, considering it is basically just a few basic jumps and that's it. This might be a controversial one, but look, I'm all for this tower's previous version getting a revamp, but what on earth did they do here? They turned this tower into a really boring modern slopfest, and it is genuinely painful to play. Sure, it's better than the previous version, but at what cost? It's not very memorable, the gameplay drags on way longer than necessary, and all the jumps are either confusing or just monotonous modern slot mechanics. Sure, there was effort put into this revamp, and the gameplay is more complex and well made, but generally I still avoid this tower as a whole. I don't really think that I enjoy this one very much. This tower has a cool idea in mind, but just has loads of issues which can't go unnoticed. There's really high punishment in this tower, which is honestly very irritating when you don't know what you're doing, and despite receiving an overhaul, it still has a load of issues with indication and gameplay being generally awkward. The frame also just looks really off. I get the whole idea, and the way it's done, well, I can see why it's done like this, but it just looks a little wrong. Sure, they were creative with the different themes, and it is cool in terms of that, but it just plays horribly. While the gameplay is sort of interesting and can be somewhat okay, it gets very repetitive and is known to spam quite a few things as it goes on. I will congratulate how much this tower experiments with some more complex mechanics like ice blocks and more advanced buttons and challenges, but a lot of this can be extremely finicky to play through and come across as a bit tacky. Other than that, it's really forgettable and has a tendency to be quite a clunky tower now and again, with some really questionable jumps that kind of bring it down a little bit. I'm really not a fan of this steeple whatsoever. It is really dark for no reason, which kind of spoils the experience because you're constantly wondering where you're actually supposed to go. Also, the gameplay is so strange and really unsight readable. The way it's designed is so similar to the actual steeple's decorations that you don't know what is gameplay and what is just there for show. It's also not very fun. A lot of jumps and mechanics are slow paced and take a lot of time to fully understand, and the steeple is a pretty boring one on the whole if you ask me. I still don't understand why this only has 9 floors, but that's besides the point. While for the most part this tower is pretty forgettable, it also has a lot of generally outdated and bad gameplay and is quite unappealing by today's standards. There are a load of traps scattered throughout the tower and some certain jumps that are used in weird ways to rage bait the player, and it just isn't all that fun. All the multiple routing parts make it look really messy, and honestly it can be kind of annoying having to deal with this. The finale is pretty bad and contains a lot of gameplay that's certain to get you annoyed, like thin studs. All in all, this tower is pretty bad for Ring 1. Another one with outdated gameplay and a lot of unnecessary traps. It just isn't very good in my opinion. The traps and jankiness make it quite a struggle to get through, and although having some creativity showing, it clearly doesn't utilise these ideas very well. It could be worse, there's definitely worse in Ring 3, but for the most part it's just extremely forgettable and doesn't really do anything other than that. Unbalanced gameplay and repetitive spam jumps are to be expected here, and all in all this tower's just kinda mid and forgettable, and once you remember it, it's bad. I think I'm one of the only people who actually remembered that this tower existed. I always thought this tower was a pain to play first try, but on the rebeat it became bearable. For starters, this tower is really short and there isn't really much to it, that being in terms of gameplay and design. There's just barely anything going on and it's uninteresting. That massive trust jump is a really nice little detail, but there isn't any need for the 2-minute climb back up. Like, come on, we don't need to do that. While the tower's forgettable, it has some pretty bad gameplay in some parts that can be unenjoyable, especially when you fall. To be honest, this is probably the most forgettable mini tower in the entire game, but at least it's here, I guess. It's a fun, easy little lobby with not much going for it, but what is there is pretty decent. The tower itself has a lot of little charms to it, like alternative routes for the pros, that make it an all-round decent experience, but it's here because again, there really just isn't much to it, and that's why it's here in E tier. I'm surprised this tower occasionally gets called the worst in the game. It doesn't suck that much, but then again, it's still pretty bad. There's a huge amount of one-studs spammed and the gameplay is really bad. The jumps are pretty, boring, generally garbage, and there are a lot of difficulty spikes that frequently come up throughout this tower that make it really aggravating. Although for some reason, I find this one oddly satisfying to beat, but it's most likely due to the high stakes on the outsides and the fact that I just prefer classic gameplay. I don't really like this tower as much as other classic towers though. To be honest, I always found this tower really unenjoyable and painful to play. The gameplay's really annoying, and because everything's so dark and dismal, it makes trying to understand the gameplay a really tedious task which I don't enjoy at all. It is somewhat creative, but only due to the theme it has, which just ends up being kind of annoying at the end of the day because you can't really see what you're doing or where you're going. Everything flows pretty poorly, and it makes for a fairly unenjoyable experience. So yeah, it was kind of bad for Ashton Tower Works. This steeple is one that focuses on traps a lot for no real reason. I feel like they were trying to stay true to the classic nature of the game, but they focused on the parts no one really enjoyed that much. The ideas it has aren't that creative, although some of the traps are, albeit kind of annoying. The steeple looks okay enough. I like how they have those little ball things from earlier towers lying around. It's fairly short, so it isn't too painful if you fall, but it can be annoying, and the rest of the gameplay is basic. The Steeple is just pretty mid, if I'm honest. Now, I have heard that this tower is planned to have a revamp soon, so if that comes out before this video releases, then I'm sorry, but I will have to cut it from the list. The current EToH I see, though, is really nothing all that interesting. While the idea and concept is alright, it just looks a little ugly at the end of the day. The tower is designed pretty poorly, and the gameplay doesn't flow very well. While the gameplay isn't terrible, it can be a bit basic at times, and I wish they did a little more here considering what this tower wanted to do. It's a tower that you're just going to forget after a couple of minutes, to be honest, and let's be fair, it's not that great. I do think this tower has a really good idea in mind, and although it would end up being used to death, this tower was kind of the pioneer of this theme. It has some quite creative sections here and there. It has things like clouds, space stations, planets, etc. And honestly, it's designed so you actually feel like you're going to space. But the tower's still quite primitive, and the decorations are kind of just weird now. The gameplay also sucks. The cloud maze and the planet jumps are so awkward, and they take a lot of tries and could keep you there for a while. It's a tower with some decent ideas, but made far too early for them to be considered good yet. In my opinion, this one is really boring and unenjoyable. I can respect just how many themes it tries to pull off, and it does this really effectively, but the gameplay within is once again the letdown here. Sure, it's creative and even uses a lot of complex mechanics that can be admired for its time, but they just aren't very fun mechanics, I'm sorry to say. They really struggle with the pacing of this tower, and it just feels really slow and repetitive, and doesn't feel like a fun experience to me. Still, it was somewhat creative at times, and that should be acknowledged. One of the first towers in the game that just dragged on ridiculously long for no apparent reason, COGD is not enjoyable whatsoever. I find the tower seems really lost with no real direction in mind, and it comes across very messy. Sure, there are some parts that are kind of creative, but they just aren't fun to play, nor do they feel like they really add anything positive to the experience. The tower even looks like a mess. It literally has a bunch of crap just crammed in, and the floors are inconsistent with one another. There's a lot of spammed gameplay and the difficulty spikes for no reason, especially around the middle floors. It would be fun if you have patience and high tolerance for older gameplay, but other than that, it's just pretty bad, and honestly, it's best you avoid this one. Probably the most forgettable tower in the entire zone, TOMC has a lot of good ideas but terrible execution. It can be very loop faily on the later floors, and the difficulty definitely spikes in certain areas due to the sudden complexity of the gameplay. It's not balanced very well, and it quite honestly shows in a lot of sections. And what also shows is that the tower wasn't quite sure how to fully grasp the capabilities of more complex mechanics. I do think the frame works well, very ominous colours towards the end, enjoyable if you're above the skill level, but even still, you're going to feel how painful the jumps get towards the end. A tower which tried, but ended up being unsuccessful due to its poor structuring. That one tower with quite possibly the most unappealing frame in the entire game. While it can be enjoyable, you have to admit that for the most part, the tower is awfully clunky and not very well made. I don't know if this is intentional or not, but it still bugs me what's considered gameplay in this tower. It does use softlocks too, which, although a good use of them, can be really demotivating if you fall. The tower is also structured weirdly too, and has weird fluctuations of difficulty that do feel kind of off at times. While grinding this is kind of fun due to the unpredictability of this tower, it definitely isn't recommended if you're someone who likes to gain consistency and control, as this tower is pretty hard to master like that. Although it kinda sucks, you can admire the certain ideas that they had for it. Hey, they moved it up to intense where it belongs. This tower is basically the summary of all Paradise Atoll's issues. The gameplay in this tower is just really unfun, and it's so easy to loop fail it. For a tower this modern, it's surprisingly janky, and the tower, whilst looking good and having a decent theme, is ruined by how unfair it can be. It does use some pretty cool mechanics, and sure, it has had a lot of effort put into it, but it really feels like, for me, a lot of effort went more into the design than the gameplay. They focus too much on trying to do cool things with client objects that they honestly just forget to make it fun and fair, which kind of weighs this tower down. So the very first kata tower that we'll be facing on this list, and to be honest, for creators who had barely any experience with kata gameplay, owing to the fact that it rarely existed before this, it actually isn't that bad. It is still quite obviously in need of improvement though. To be fair, the tower does a good job offering some basic kata jumps, and it is actually quite advanced in this despite being quite primitive in the sense of kata towers. Although, some jumps are a little bit RNG at times, and there is a lot of unbalanced gameplay which is prone to difficulty spikes and unsight readability at certain points. It's obviously not a very good tower, but for the first kata, you could have expected a lot worse, to be fair. Our first Purgatorio tower on this list, jeez is this tower a massive boring snooze fest. The whole idea of X pushers can only really supply you with a limited amount of gameplay, and I just don't think it really needed its own tutorial when a tower like EToH could have done this thing just fine. On top of that, a lot of jumps aren't easy to sight read, and you have to apply a lot of outside knowledge to this one, which is not good for a beginner who stayed in Purgatorio. It's also way too long, longer than it needs to be. Although sometimes creative and you can tell a lot of effort went into it, it's really boring and drags on way longer than it needs to. If you've been on my streams, you know that me and this tower have a personal history. Not only is this tower annoying and has gameplay that looks hard to grasp, it also just feels a little underwhelming in my opinion. I mean sure, what can you do for a tower themed around jazz, but this tower still feels quite basic and boring for something that has a lot more potential. When it's not boring, it's repetitive, irritating, and occasionally unsight readable when the gameplay gets more complex. It's a bit of a slop tower which is very forgettable and doesn't have that much good going for it. This one suffers a lot from just being uninteresting and forgettable. Most of the stuff in this tower is netted, and while that can feel nice to play something more chill, this tower is quite easy to loop fail due to the confusing and more complicated gameplay, which, while creative, can be painful to play at certain points, especially at the finale. The puzzles are well made, but they feel so forced and require you to use a guide because of how unnecessarily hard they are. It's a well crafted tower, but it just seems to focus on just experimenting with client objects rather than creating good gameplay out of it. So here we are, the infamous Citadel of Victory. This one's like Marmite, you very much either love it or hate it, and for me I think I prefer the latter end of the stick here. Sure, it has a lot of really innovative mechanics and a wide variety of themes, but it's just so damn loop faily and unsight readable that it absolutely ruins the whole experience for me. I tried to like it, but every time I did I just ended up hating it more due to how rough and weird the gameplay gets. It's probably a really good time for those who are really patient, but for beginners and people like me, it's just an hour of torture and fries your brain. At least the Rainbow Road section was nice to see, I suppose. This will be controversial, oh so controversial, but I just could not bring myself to like this tower as much as I wanted to. There's just too much going on for me. You very much need a guide to figure everything out, and the mechanics can be somewhat overwhelming, especially considering the tower thrusts you into them with little consideration for teaching you how they work. I like the ideas, and I also like the lore of this tower. The final stretch is a little unnecessary, but it makes sense. The only thing that lets down this tower tremendously is how confusing it is, and how the design can make it a pretty rough experience due to it being overall dark like all the time. Navigation is a real struggle in this one, and because of that, it's just not very enjoyable for me. To be fair, another one that might receive some controversy, but I am not a fan of all the balloon gameplay. I think it can be used as a cheap cop-out of making actual jumps, and while the Steeple doesn't do stuff like that because that's the main theme of the Steeple, it does make for some really annoying stuff that can happen, and it felt like the later floors were just really rushed and they were honestly just confusing on where to go. While the design is really cool and the story is interesting enough, and goofy as well, the Steeple comes off as quite underwhelming considering the very high expectations for this area. I feel like this tower should get some sort of revamp pretty soon, as it's one of those that desperately need it. There's a lot of effort put in to make this tower look cool, which half works because this tower is fairly old and occasionally just looks a little bit stupid because of this. There are also a lot of petty traps scattered across the tower that kind of weigh down the experience just a little bit, when it could have been a lot better. In fact, a lot of people are probably thinking this one's a little high, and that's because I admire what this tower tried to do and how it's sometimes creative, but it's just that nowadays there's really no place for gameplay like this, and it could do with a bit of a modernisation, to be honest, or maybe a revamp, one of the two. So we get to the good old fashioned rem that everyone and their mothers has tried to grind. Honestly, it's not that bad. It's kind of fun to play and the gameplay is quite experimental with styles of jump that can be quite creative, although this tower is prone to a lot of rage bait. There's a lot of kill brick spam in this tower and healing can be an absolute pain. Failing is also quite punishing because there are a lot of traps in this tower that go unindicated, which can make the experience very unenjoyable if you don't have practice with it. A lot of jumps are also very awkward. Oh yeah, and the frame is just lazy, like come on, seriously. The tower is bad, but has a few good redeeming qualities that keep it afloat from being down in E tier. This tower has a very unique concept, that being glitching your heart out and going through basically all the glitches while also dodging a bunch of kill bricks. Therefore, it's a tower that you can enjoy pretty well, or one that you'll find basically unplayable. Of course, being a tower based primarily on glitchy jumps, you better believe it's pretty janky at a lot of points. You will be required to make sure your precision is key, and you'll also need to practice all the glitches. Upon further practicing, this tower is much better, but still it feels clunky and weird to play through at a lot of points, and for that it's not the most fun to do. While the old Terrible Mondays had some pretty bad gameplay which was spammed a lot, and heavy amounts of repetitive stuff like the occasional walking sim, it was quite fun at some points and you could tell where it inspired the modern version. It isn't unplayable or anything, just the main issue was that it was incredibly boring. Again, like the new version. That's kind of to be expected for a hard dissension tower though. It's not great and definitely not worth your time, but if you do check it out, it's somewhat bearable. I wouldn't go into it expecting it to be absolutely horrible. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of weird misalignments. It's very flawed and it looks pretty ugly, but it's not awful. A very controversial tower. I just couldn't really get behind the idea of liking this one. It honestly isn't that beautiful in my opinion and doesn't really play that well in all honesty. Sure, once you get the hang of things it's okay, but it is a struggle to actually get the hang of anything in the first place. Grinding, it's an awful experience, and the client objects, although simple and easy to learn, can feel like a struggle to do when you're not used to them. It's a tower which suffers a lot of flaws, and those flaws ruin it a lot for me. We have finally reached what many of you wanted gone probably a while ago. This tower actually made it surprisingly high up the list, higher than I expected it to be in all honesty. To be fair, I find this tower oddly enjoyable to rebeat, and the flex tape music is honestly hilarious. That said, I can't deny that there is a ton of spam within the tower and it looks really ugly and uninspired. It's bland in a lot of places and can have gameplay that is really janky and hard to master. The traps also make it a bad experience, which is to be expected. It's a bad tower, but for some reason I somewhat enjoy the grind of this. Maybe I'm just mental, I don't know. But yeah, I mean, it's somewhat fun and, you know, it's a bit overhated. I do think people throw a lot of hate onto this tower, and while it deserves a lot of it, you have to admit it did some good in some places. There are definitely confusing moments and the outer space section is awful to play through, but the design and thought that went into this tower was really good for its time. In my opinion, it just tried to do a bit too much with resources they couldn't do a lot with. and that made the tower feel a lot worse than it should have. The creative themes in this will always be kinda cool, despite the tower itself lacking in anything otherwise. Another visit down to Arcane area, Steeple of Twisted Crystals was just unenjoyable for me. I couldn't really engage with the story, and navigating this one guideless can be a pretty bad experience when you aren't capable enough to comprehend what's going on. The themes are interesting, and there is effort put into the Steeple, but it just came across as unfun and a little mediocre to me, if I'm being honest. Including a quiz was, a little weird, but then I guess it's been done in other towers as well, and, if you want to do it, you can. I was just kind of glad it was over upon completion, and I have rarely ever returned since, due to the gameplay not really being my style, I don't really want to come back, Yeah, this Steeple really doesn't have anything going for it, does it? It's immensely forgettable, contains some questionable jumps, and overall, the unindication and slightly annoying conveyor jumps hold this tower back a little bit, due to how unfair it can feel at these certain points. While it's better than other classic towers, it still isn't that good and kind of went for a more traditional, bland appeal rather than a more fair approach that other Ridge towers took. It's just really forgettable, and the jumps really show that in a lot of areas where it feels like they had no real inspiration, nor an idea on what to do. This sneak is definitely overhated by the community, but I can see some of their points. This one does have some really flawed gameplay, and it does feel really outdated to play, especially with all those weird wraps, but I kind of feel like this was the intention due to it being a neat. I know it ain't great and it can be quite unfair, but this is kind of what I expected from a neat of this difficulty, to be honest. Like, they're never going to be that great. This Steeple, another one that was really unsight readable and gave me a lot of rage due to how painful it was to play. There's a lot of nets, but this leads to it being really loop faily and makes for a lot of sections where it seems like the jumps are purposefully janky because they know they can get away with it. Theme isn't all that great either, other Steeples do better concepts, this one kinda just exists and has pretty bad mechanics within it. There's badly indicated client objects and a lot of poorly made sections that just make this one feel off. It's good in terms of creative CO usage, but bad in terms of what's actually done with it in the end. This is probably the first neat we have covered that I probably truly enjoy. I think the gameplay in this one is enjoyable and it is the perfect use of punishment while also maintaining its fairness. It does difficulty spike at a lot of points, but then again, expectations are low. It's really fun to grind out and beating it feels rewarding, especially after that massive outside. Jumps are intricately designed and the pacing works well. It's surprising how creative they got here, considering this is a neat. In my opinion, the old Toad wasn't really abysmal. The theming was actually kind of okay for its time, and the gameplay could be kind of annoying, but it fit with what the tower was going for and it sort of worked. Although a lot of areas did feel bland and empty, and there were some areas within the tower that felt uninspired. While definitely having a lot of flaws, they didn't fully ruin the experience, and honestly the tower was fine for what it was. Although I wish this tower kind of utilised the aesthetic a bit more, and the final floor was also basically just an instant win. It would have been nice to see just how far they could go with it. A mediocre tower, but not horrendous in my opinion. Yeah, this one tried to be fun and unique, but ended up just being annoying and ridiculous in a lot of places. The gameplay is quite clunky and a little unsight readable, and there are a lot of unindicated jumps, as well as jumps that can be really hard to do without the use of a guide. There were some interesting concepts within this tower, and they were shown quite well, but actually playing some of them was a different story. It feels off and just doesn't play the way that I believe they intended it to be played. Also, the overall design is quite primitive and it stops this tower from truly feeling unique in my opinion. It isn't lazy, but it definitely would be by today's standards. Paradise Atoll is kind of known for having gameplay that is really unenjoyable, and I believe this Steeple is a fine example of how that comes across. The mechanics are really hard to grasp and the gameplay can be really annoying to get the hang of. Also, this Steeple is really punishing. A bad fail streak can send you back perhaps all the way to the start if you're that careless, and while that would work in other cases, this Steeple has really loop-faily gameplay, so you can imagine how aggravating it can be to try and grind this out legit. It's also hugely unsight readable too, making for a harsh experience all over. It's a cool Steeple, but it's just not very fun to play whatsoever. I have deeply mixed emotions about this tower. I think the gameplay and mechanics used are actually quite cool in a lot of places, but can be really hard to understand properly. And this tower also drags on for far too long in my opinion. It can therefore be quite boring and forgettable because of this. While I don't hate it, I can definitely understand why some people do. It's not a great tower, which is insanely monotonous when you actually sit down and play it properly. Also, it's got the cool client objects, but it's just not really worth it for this tower, considering it causes a lot of problems for it in terms of the sight readability. It just makes it overall less enjoyable to play. This one was kind of a mediocre addition to Ring 2 in my opinion. It just feels really slow and boring. There's a lot of areas in the tower that feel like huge spikes, and the gameplay can be quite unfun in a lot of places. That said, the general quality of the tower is much higher than a lot of other towers in this ring, so I'll give it that. Also, the theme of the big hole is simplistic, but it is a nice touch. I suppose it can make for some interesting scenarios. At the end of the day though, this tower is pretty bland and mediocre, and doesn't really offer all that much to the player that hasn't been seen before in other towers. The current TOL has made some efforts to be better and a lot more interesting. The entire tower feels a lot more fair and the overall gameplay is much better than it had been previously in the last version. However, there is some questionable design choices and some of the jumps suffer the same feeling of frustration that the previous version had before. The final two floors are still an absolute pain though, and it almost seems like they didn't really do anything to fix that, which I guess isn't a terrible thing, but they could have at least made it more comfortable to play through. The revamp helped a lot with the tower, but the tower is still pretty mid in my opinion. I still don't like it very much. I will admit that this tower has some of the jankiest gameplay I've ever seen, and there are a lot of difficulty spikes, mostly caused by the sheer number of really unpredictable wedge jumps. While all of this makes a rough experience along with the spammed jumps, for some reason this one can actually be somewhat enjoyable to grind, once you have the practice and it's rewarding to beat as well. The partial safety nets are also godsends in this tower. They make the overall experience more bearable, although the clunky gameplay and ridiculous jumps can be really unnecessary and they kind of feel forced in a lot of the time. In my opinion, this tower feels like it's from Arcane Area and Paradise Atoll, and unfortunately that's not really a good thing. Some floors are overall just too lengthy and it makes for some really boring gameplay. The whole theme's actually really cool, but it can be really confusing, especially considering there's a lot of backtracking in this one, and it can be quite complicated to figure out where you're supposed to go. A lot of the mechanics are also quite complex, and they sometimes can cause the difficulty to spike in some sections. Cool themes, nice idea, but I can't help but feel like they didn't make a very good time out of it, and this is why we have the kind of messy thing we have today. This Steeple was going to be a lot lower, but after recently replaying it, I realised that it's not as horrendous as I initially thought. The underwater theme is done quite well, and the outside, although really annoying at points, implements some really creative mechanics that have been done really well. It's one of those Steeples that I personally don't like, but I have to commend the effort that was put into it. Although that said, the gameplay drags on for far too long, and the Steeple has a sight readability problem because it can be quite confusing with all the complex mechanics, despite what they did with them being really unique and creative. It's a Steeple with good ideas, but it just, at the end of the day, isn't very fun to play. I don't know if it's just me or not, but the old Citadel of green stuff feels really empty and bland. Like, all the floors are designed so poorly that it just feels like there's nothing really to it. Sure, there are some decent ideas and the whole concept was good enough, but it just doesn't seem like much effort was put into the gameplay, and sadly that shows throughout the whole Citadel. Sure, it's fun at some points and there's some moments of genuine creativity that do appear occasionally the more you play, but the whole experience is overshadowed by the fact that it just doesn't feel like there's anything going on. It sometimes makes you feel a bit claustrophobic. Somewhat enjoyable, but just feels really off in my opinion. Sorry, but does anyone actually remember this exists? Well, some people do, all 5 of us. Playing through this tower made me realise how primitive everything felt in it. There's a lot of difficulty spikes and the gameplay can be quite questionable since they use the client objects really strangely in this tower. When it isn't being an overall clunky experience, it can feel like quite a generic one. There's a lot of parts in this tower that are quite bland, and this shows a lot in the later floors. It just feels like they wanted to wrap things up. I do like how this tower looks like a flame though. Kind of fits the acronym in a way, but at the end of the day, it's a mid-tower. Reaching Steel Spire Horizon for the first time, we get to this one. Honestly, while I understand a lot of the appeal for it and the client objects are really well made, they can be quite hard to navigate and can feel very annoying to have to go through. Also, this tower kind of drags on a little bit. There isn't really a whole lot of button progress, so failing can be really demotivating if you're not careful, which can make the entire tower feel quite irritating. It's a little loop faily, and that seriously lets this tower down. That said, some of the way they use client objects are really unique, and this tower definitely tries its best to be interesting, which I feel that it does quite well. To be fair, this one was kind of a lot more hated than it should have been in my opinion. Sure, it's really janky and there's a lot of awkward gameplay that can feel really frustrating to do, but I honestly liked some sections within this Steeple, and I just can't see why people are putting it in the same category as something like EToH. There's effort put into it, and honestly the theme is quite intriguing and can be quite good. That said, I can agree that the gameplay is what ruins this Steeple massively. So many jumps are made so poorly and it feels like an absolute pain getting back up because of the fact that a lot of jumps do feel RNG. So yeah, I guess this Steeple does kind of suck a little bit. This tower is really boring, and none of its unique or creative ideas can save that in my opinion. The routing is really bad, a lot of gameplay blends in with decoration and it can be so hard to actually find your way through this tower effectively. It doesn't suck, some of the jumps can be really interesting and the finale is really cool, it feels like you're in the heavens. Other than that though, it doesn't really feel like there's anything all that interesting in this tower, and it just seems like filler compared to the rest of Ashen Tower works that all have unique themes, and this one's just kind of here with no real interesting gameplay that supports it. Another tower in Purgatorio which suffers from a bit of a boredom issue. Critical damage is one that can be pretty painful to play. At the start it's kind of walking simulator, and as it goes on it just feels really uninteresting and appears to just drag on a little bit. Although that said, it does have some unique ideas and the airship thing's pretty cool too. It kind of reminds me of Ancient Trickery with all the temple stuff, and while it's cool to see that, it sadly just feels too boring and unsight readable to really be any good in my opinion. It's well made and everything, just has a few flaws that bring down the experience quite a bit and can make the tower quite unenjoyable. I have mixed feelings on Tower of Killjoys. It's one of those towers that pushed the boundaries of what was possible back in the day. The first 5 floors are genuinely really fun, despite having some outdated gameplay nowadays. A lot of creative jumps like the key collection and the push boxes make this tower stand out a lot from the rest of Ring 1. Not to mention the wacky frame, which is quite interesting. The crossing to Neat is also something worth noting. However, the rest of the tower is just so boring. The later floors lose a lot of the initial charm and can feel a lot like walking and healing simulator at points. It really sets the tower back in my opinion because it's just so flawed in the second half. A tower with decent ideas and started off alright, but terrible execution towards the end. While this tower honestly wasn't great, it didn't really need the revamp. The gameplay was pretty mid for the most part. Some jumps were pretty garbage and the overall experience was very subjective as it could be fluked or be absolute hell to grind out. The softlocks and questionable jumps later on could be quite frustrating and unfun at a lot of points. But this tower also did some pretty creative stuff, like the tower crossings and some of the mechanics they use, even though they can be a bit learny. It's cool to see what they did on this tower, and it did quite a few good things. So yeah, sad to see it go, but I can kind of see why the devs decided to change it up a bit and bring in the Tower of Infinity Gauntlet we know today. So the purist gameplay is kind of respectable in this tower. It's cool to see what they actually did without client objects. However, a lot of this tower is really skippable and it can be quite janky at times. There's a lot of visible misalignments which isn't very appealing, and the tower has a few jumps which can be quite poor in quality, and it does sometimes weigh down the experience. That said, it's a really fun one to grind and speedrun, and the difficulty is for the most part quite consistent. Final Outside is torture, but that is probably to be expected by a Final Outside. Slightly outdated tower, but still one that's kind of enjoyable if you know what you're doing and if you like to speedrun stuff. Yeah, not even going to lie, I really didn't like this tower and I found it quite frustrating and unfun to play at a lot of points. I like the whole concept, it makes for some interesting stuff, and the tower is frequently designed really well in terms of the themes that they go for, and the story's pretty goofy too. However, due to the gameplay being pretty complicated and annoying at a lot of points, it can be really easy to loop fail, which in my opinion makes the experience a lot more painful to play through. Because it's mostly netted, it also gives them excuses to place a lot of stupid jumps, and the tower just doesn't feel all that enjoyable to me. This tower was a cool addition to Ring 9, and the theme and design is really cool and can be done really well at a lot of points, but a lot of the tower can feel really slow to go through, and there is a certain inconsistency with some of the gameplay earlier on that can make grinding this a quite annoying experience if you are coming in without practice. It just doesn't feel like the tower was optimised all that well, and despite its really cool and complex design, the tower suffers a lot of shortcomings that make its inclusion in the game feel at some points unnecessary and forced. I only really remember this tower because it had about 50 homes in the game before finally settling in Zone 3. To be honest, this tower isn't all that memorable, and a lot of the jumps feel really basic and boring. This tower also just seems like it has a lot of unnecessary jumps that kind of weigh down the experience. While it uses quite a lot of mechanics for something so simple, it does make some of these feel quite forced, and they do often feel a bit out of place in a tower like this. It's just a little bit bland, to be honest, and compared to the rest of Zone 3, it can be a little underwhelming and feel like it's just a bit lazy at some occasions. Yeah, when you have a lot of people working on one tower, it can end up just being really inconsistent and dodgy as a result. Sure, the amount of different themes can be really interesting and the unpredictability of the gameplay can be somewhat fun, but sometimes the tower's just so unfun to play because of the way they use the mechanics. It almost seems like the tower's rage bait at sometimes because there are so many difficulty spikes and poor design choices that make this tower feel annoying and unfair. While it's cool to see something new, it fails at being a fair and good experience. This tower was kind of ahead of its time in terms of its design and theming. It honestly feels really unique at a lot of sections, but it also utilises the most stupid gameplay known to man. There's usage of softlocks in this tower as well, which is genuinely really annoying. While there are safety nets, unfortunately this is used to make the gameplay really loop faily, and there are some parts in the tower that are really unsight readable for no apparent reason. And it can be really frustrating trying to progress in this tower. That said, you can appreciate how well it was using certain mechanics, and it was definitely trying quite hard with them. While I personally find this tower enjoyable, I have to admit that it's honestly pretty bad in terms of how unplayable it can be at certain points in the tower. It's really short, but it contains a lot of very questionable jumps that can honestly make the tower quite annoying if you don't know how to navigate around them. The gameplay is just a bit unbalanced and pretty old, so you'll find it uses some pretty questionable techniques to try and create difficulty. Also, floor 10's annoyingly scary when it comes to that one thin stud and the kill brick cylinder roll. It's just some unfair stuff like that which brings the tower down a bit. It could have been up in C tier. Is it just me, or is the revamp of this tower really boring? I mean, sure, the jumps are so much better and the tower just feels a lot more playable than it used to be, but it is still really boring and feels uninspired compared to other revamps that were pretty decent. The X pusher usage is quite good and the tower stays true to the original without including its flaws, which I do like, but I just feel like this new version has really repetitive jumps and can begin to get really old really quickly in terms of using a boring and monotone style of gameplay. It's not bad per se, but I just don't think it's very fun to play and definitely could still use a bit of work. I know some people like this tower, but in my opinion it isn't very good and can be really poorly made in a lot of parts. For starters, yes, the theme is quite cool and the whole idea of a massive windmill is a creative one that does deserve some recognition, but the gameplay is so unbalanced and janky. It gets better towards the end, but at the start it's really weird to play and honestly quite easy to loop fail if you're not careful. The mechanics in the main gimmick of this tower don't really seem to make sense to me, and they don't work like the creator intended them to. In all honesty, this tower's a bit of a fail, and it needs some further development and optimization to feel and play better than it currently does. This steeple is just a bit meh in my opinion. It can be quite unsight readable, and despite the themes being quite interesting, especially the hot and cold floor, they can often be a little boring and sometimes have some pretty questionable gameplay that doesn't really work with the theme and idea they have. The steeple itself is an okay experience, but honestly just isn't that enjoyable, and the pushbox on the desert floor is an absolute pain to go through, and the steeple can at a few times feel unfair and unfun to play due to the bad gameplay choices. It's a pretty decent design though, and I do like the themes that this tower uses. I thought that this tower had some pretty good and interesting stuff, but honestly it just wasn't that enjoyable for me. The difficulty is quite inconsistent, and the tower also often resorts to some pretty unfair tactics trying to get you to fall. The final two floors are crafted really well though, and I kind of wish the whole tower was like that. It would be much more enjoyable. The puzzles are also quite annoying, some are just really confusing and others just aren't really crafted that well for me to enjoy them that much. It's a little loop faily, and though it's well made, it's kind of ruined by the gameplay a little bit. This steeple is honestly pretty forgettable, but to be fair, the gameplay, while being really unique, does suffer from being unfun and severely unsight readable. It's easy to eventually understand, but I feel like the steeple is just too annoying to be enjoyed in my opinion. The final floor is also an absolute pain to play through due to how loop faily and ridiculous it is, and it's designed so over the top that I just can't tell what the right way is to go in this steeple at most points. I have to admire the sheer effort and thought behind it though. It's definitely better than a lot of towers in terms of its theme, and that does deserve to be spoken about, but at the end of the day it's just not very fun to play and it doesn't really play that well for me. This is that one tower that you forget about, but when you revisit it, you realise perhaps it's better off forgotten. The tower is really vibrant, and that is one of its positives. The design's overall simplistic, and that is quite a breath of fresh air in many ways. But some of these jumps are just so damn finicky, and it can be really hard to deal with, especially towards the later floors. One upside though is that it's not too complicated, and once you get to learn how to pass the clunky client objects, then it becomes a lot easier to manage. A meh tower, but it's better than it initially comes across. Tower of Augmented Misery is one that can cause you a lot of stress to grind, and the tower in my opinion is quite poorly optimised. The first few floors are very tedious and can feel like an absolute pain to play sometimes. Although the gameplay flows very well and can be enjoyable once you're more familiar with the way the tower works, it contains a lot of difficulty spikes later on that can severely damage the overall experience of this tower, and features a lot of areas in which loot failing is very frequent. It's a tower which is pretty mid and contains a lot of rough floors, in my opinion, that bring it down quite a lot. So, to be honest, the gimmick is what ruins this tower's enjoyability for me. The wind mechanic is just so frustrating and it makes all the jumps become so jank to play due to the fact that you have to time them so precisely. It also, like most towers in this sub-realm, suffers from being very unsight readable and definitely prioritises the design over the gameplay. The facility part is boring and can be annoyingly confusing to navigate, and to be honest, the whole experience kind of left a bad impression on me which hadn't been resolved. The design is admittedly quite good though, and the tower is pretty good in terms of its decorations. Tower of Mirrored Heck is still not very good and is still unfun to play. How disappointing. I mean, sure, the gameplay is better by miles and they turned this tower into a much more memorable experience, but they also made a complete modern slop. I do like how the floor colours are reversed from Heck, that is pretty interesting, and I guess that somewhat mirrors EToH in a way. The only issue I have with it is that it turned the original into modern slop, which is something that cannot be overlooked. It just is so boring to play and it drags on for so long for basically no reason. It doesn't really feel like how it's supposed to and makes the whole tower feel like a bit of a chore to complete. It was so close to being okay, but did a lot of rubbish things that cannot go unnoticed. The later floors were horrible to play and were really unsight readable and confusing. The vine mechanic is cool and fresh at the start, but as it goes on it begins to feel worn out and ends up becoming a massive pain to keep on doing over and over again. This tower can also be quite clunky at times, with some jumps having quite a few problems in which they can sometimes be kind of filler, or they can be those stupid floaty jump things that are a pain to try and master. Honestly, this tower is half filler and half annoying, and despite the design and creative ideas, it is significantly worse compared to the rest of the zone. Welcome to the C tier. Tower of Extreme Hell begins this tier for us. I have no idea why people despise this tower so much, when it actually isn't all that bad to be honest. It does have a lot of janky stuff and is very loop faily, don't get me wrong, and some jumps are horrible and literally RNG, but it also has some half decent ideas and manages to execute a few of these pretty well, although it sometimes just creates complete rubbish out of them, which I don't like. The tower itself is insanely mixed in terms of how playable it is, but the hate is just so unnecessary for something that isn't really that bad, although yes, it is pretty flawed, but it isn't abysmal. The music in this tower is really good, that's something it's got going for it I guess, but this tower for me is really forgettable. The gameplay's alright, though it can resort to some really annoying tactics like using mazes and odd balloon usage to try and create difficulty, which is just a pain to play and feels quite forced in there to be honest. The rest of this tower is just complete filler and there really isn't that much to say about it besides that it's kind of annoying in some parts, but the frame actually looks really nice and the overall experience is pretty mixed. A mid tower that is somewhat overhated but mostly just forgotten about by everyone. This tower is overglazed in my opinion and it actually has some pretty annoying gameplay. There's a pretty decent balance between client objects and purism, and the theme of the tower is really cool and it feels like a massive breath of fresh air from the stereotypical other slop that's used in modern towers. However, I still think it has a big issue with its gameplay. This tower has some really unfun gameplay and it is quite complicated in a lot of areas, leading to many loop fails if you're not careful, which completely ruins the initial positive feeling I had about this tower. It is really well made, I have to give it that, but so many jumps were so hard to understand that I ended up honestly not really enjoying it that much at all in the end. The old Dusty Dunes wasn't that bad, although it was very loop failure in my opinion. The theme was pretty cool and the gameplay was mostly not awful despite having a few jumps that were genuinely really hard to master. The whole sand dune feel was a really unique one that felt different from the rest in Paradise Atoll, but it did make for some annoying gameplay in terms of the gimmicks that it influenced. While it is fun once you know what you're doing, playing it blind is an absolutely awful experience due to some gameplay being exceptionally hard to understand in some parts. Overall, it wasn't a terrible Steeple, and it wasn't bad enough to warrant the need of a revamp to be made on it. I think it was actually fine the way it was. After getting revamped, the tower is much better, but it still suffers from a little bit of a boredom problem at times. There isn't really that much going on in this tower, and it is still largely a pretty forgettable one, despite receiving a lot of good improvements for the most part. The tower is way better optimised though, all the jumps are much more fair and they do a lot to make sure it's actually varied and true to its difficulty. It still just isn't very fun however, and despite there being better gameplay than the previous version and it's been cleared of all the Z fighting, it still has that feeling of repetitiveness and slight boredom that the old one had, just slightly less of it this time than there was last time obviously. This tower was actually pretty ahead of its time in terms of how wacky it is. It feels like the kind of idea that a much more modern tower would have, and to me that makes it at least a little bit decent I suppose. There isn't that much memorable about it though, and the frame is about the only thing that can really keep this tower creative in my opinion. But then again, the whole design is kind of enough to keep this tower pretty intimidating. The gameplay does flow quite well, but it is often quite annoying and the spinner on floor 9 is pretty unnecessary. The challenges are a mixed bag, some are good, some are painful, and this whole tower is a bit of a hit or miss in my opinion. It's half decent, half less decent. I think this Steeple honestly has a really goofy theme and it's somewhat good, yet can also kind of ruin it a little bit. Some of the gameplay is pretty loop-faily and can be kind of annoying to play through if you struggle with more complex mechanics, which I do a lot to be honest. The design is really cool though. I like how this Steeple takes place on a literal massive slice of pizza. At least I think that's a massive slice of pizza, I don't really know. It's a little enjoyable, but at the end it decides to put in a final stretch, and the gameplay within that final stretch is, well, first off it's timed, but it's also really poorly executed. A decent Steeple, but it can feel a bit cruel and harsh with that final stretch going on. This tower has received a lot of improvements, but it doesn't really feel very true to the original, I do have to say. The tower still has the same progression and feel as the original in some ways, but they kind of made it a lot different in terms of gameplay. And while that gameplay is a lot better than it had previously been, it can feel like a bit of modern slop in some senses, and a lot of it feels forced and unnecessary for a tower like this. I do like how much better optimised the tower is though, and it turned a lot of filler stuff into genuinely creative ideas that feel and play pretty well considering where they are. While the tower may not be remotely the same, it's a lot more enjoyable than it had been before, which is always a bonus. This is another tower that gets a little bit too much hate to be honest, when it's actually a pretty varied and cool experience if you actually know what you're doing and you're patient with it. It's really well designed, and although the progression can feel a bit slow at points, I love how much it does with creating all these different environments and themes and blending them together. It's not all that enjoyable though, and the whole concept of having to find a button on most of the floors can make for a really stressful time because of how much you have to backtrack if you miss one. Also, the maze is not needed, and the 7th and 8th floors are a bit of a spike. Besides that, this tower is overall not actually as bad as people like to say it is. I honestly love the theme of this one. It seems only in EToH you can find the literal entire tower which is dedicated to the theme of eggs. It's really goofy and out there, but hey, it's a good idea and I'm for it. It's decently creative, and the tower does have a lot of good ideas, but some do feel like they had a lot more potential than was shown and can feel a bit dragged out or underwhelming. It's also not really that enjoyable, it drags on and some of the jumps are really weird and can take a lot of effort to navigate properly, which is kind of annoying to be honest. The gameplay itself is alright, but again can be kind of annoying and a little bit unsight readable in certain aspects of it. So while the tower is creative, it just has a few enjoyability issues that kind of ruin it a bit. We finally make it to the first tower ever made in the game, and honestly it did really well to outlast this many other towers, and I believe this tower has a certain charm to it that no other one has. The tower is pretty simplistic, it is the first in the game, it didn't have really any rules to follow, and therefore it looks and feels pretty weird to play sometimes, but it works well. It's really enjoyable once you know where the traps are and how to deal with them, and speedrunning this is also a ton of fun to do due to the many little hidden shortcuts scattered around here and there. The gameplay is also surprisingly okay. Sure, it's nothing special and can be a little janky at times, but it doesn't have any visible misalignments, which is very good for the time. Mid by today's standards, but back then, pretty decent. This tower was one that I thought was really weird to play through, and I believe that the gameplay is really awkward and can ruin the feeling this tower is supposed to have for the most part. It looks cool, I like the whole curved frame stuff, it makes way for some good ideas to be explored, and the jumps are themed in a way where you can genuinely feel like you're in some kind of chain thing. However, it's just not really very enjoyable, and it can be hard to navigate because the colours are all the same, and it's very monotonous in that aspect because you don't know if you should jump on something. The gameplay is alright, but kind of boring as it goes on, and can be a little too complicated at times. A very overhated tower. In my opinion, this is a wild experience with a lot of weird stuff to unpack, which can be either good or bad, but definitely memorable to say the least, especially the finale. The frame is absolutely hilarious, and honestly it is a really interesting design for its time. It allows for a certain sense of unpredictability. It also features a wide variety of different styles throughout, which is pretty cool, although the gameplay is kind of what makes it suck a little bit. It can be really unsight readable, which affects the enjoyability immensely, because some jumps are just impossible to understand first try, and the tower punishes you quite hard for this, and it sometimes is quite unfair towards the player. A good tower in terms of how innovative it is, but bad with its gameplay. For some reason I find this tower oddly fun to play through despite it being very old and having a few shortcomings. It's one of those towers which is really rewarding to beat in my opinion. It isn't all that creative and copies the spinning kill brick finale that EToH has, but it's not awful, just a little uninspired in places, and there just isn't really that much to see here besides the jumps. They are enjoyable, however. Falling on a trap or on a generally clunky jump can be a really annoying occurrence, which understandably ruins this for a lot of people, and this tower has a lot of thin stud usage too. The gameplay is a mixed bag of generic stuff to some absolute torture, and while this brings the tower down a lot, it's very rewarding to beat and can be very good fun in some places. The frame also feels really ominous, I don't know why, but yeah, decent tower, just a little bit flawed. So yeah, this tower gets a lot of hate by a lot of people, and I can understand why they hate it, but I also think it's not all bad, just very underwhelming and uncomfortable compared to the rest of the zone. It's pretty creative in terms of how it's designed. There are some parts which I thought were genuinely unique, and I honestly wonder how they managed to get it in some cases. Like, it's kind of weird gameplay, but it's let down significantly by how loot failure it gets. Like, this is a severely loot failure tower. It's quite bad compared to the rest of Zone 7 actually, and it's alarming how some of the jumps are this clunky. That said, this tower has really good ideas and uses them effectively, even if some of them end up being a little questionable or strange in some cases. And yes, it kind of sucks to play, but I respect the thought that went into it. What even is there to say about this tower? I mean, I guess it's a really chill experience that is quite relaxing to go through, and there isn't really any sense of difficulty in the world with this one. It's literally so easy. However, it does have a bit of a problem with being really bland and basic. There's barely anything going on, and a detention tower of this difficulty is going to suffer majorly in one key factor, and that's enjoyability. Everything's just so slow, even for an easy. It's just walking simulator for the most part, and though it's simple and the gameplay is well crafted, I can't help but feel like it's a massive snooze fest that could have done a lot more to be interesting, but just ended up being another easy tower that's boring. When they went over the arcane area and gave it the revamp, I was honestly surprised that they chose to give this Steeple one of the revamps. In my opinion, it was mid, but it didn't really need it when you compare it to what else was here. It was decently creative and had some cool stuff like its very own neat. The final stretch was alright despite having a boring and finicky push box, and it experimented with different themes. It was decently enjoyable and the gameplay flowed alright, but it did suffer a few shortcomings. The Steeple had a lot of parts that were a little clunky, and it could sometimes be annoying to play due to the fact that the Steeple could feel a little slow, and the jumps were occasionally structured a bit weirdly. This Steeple is actually the most overhated thing in the entire game. It literally isn't that bad. I thought the lava rising aspect was really cool, and it was nice to have something a bit different. The Steeple itself wasn't really that creative, but it didn't do a terrible job at making gameplay that was designed to be done really quickly. The heavy kill brick usage works, and it really adds to the intimidating atmosphere of the Steeple. Although it's slightly annoying, and it can feel a bit loop failure to the beginner who isn't used to it, I think the experience is actually really fun, and escaping the lava is an exhilarating feeling. The button hunt at the end is a little weird and kind of feels out of place, however, and although the gameplay is supposed to be whizzed through, I can't help but feel like it's somewhat rushed in some aspects because of this. So yeah, this tower is another that you kind of either love or hate, and personally I see both sides of the spectrum with this one, and I'm not sure how I feel about it in all honesty. While it's an interesting, terrifying tower which has a lot of unique elements that add difficulty and feels quite unpredictable to play through at certain points, I can't help but feel like the gameplay is immensely janky in this tower. It's one of those which utilises a lot of thin studs and has many really intricate wraparounds which can be an absolute pain to do. It's one of those you either fluke or suffer on for ages. It's short but sometimes a little too punishing, and I believe that the final outside is kind of unnecessary and a little cruel in my opinion. Otherwise, it's a pretty overhated one to be fair. The old Tower of Rage had its problems, but was honestly an alright tower that I don't think was really in dire need of a revamp, although some parts of the tower were a little stupid I suppose. It was decently creative, it had a lot of unique ideas like a tightrope maze, and while it was an idea that didn't really make for good entertainment, you can admire the thought behind it. It was fairly enjoyable, the jumps felt pretty fair for the most part, and the only horrible things I can think of are the tightrope maze and that swinging platform waiting simulator that just wasn't really necessary, was it? The gameplay was quite experimental, and it had some parts which are really jank, and some which can still be seen today as pretty good attempts for a tower of its time. It wasn't that bad, but was very annoying at some times. I don't really think there's all that much to say about this Steeple. It's kind of just here for the laughs, and no one really thinks twice about it. It's also very short for some reason. I couldn't tell you why. It actually has some pretty decent design for what it's worth. The castle and nature theme stuff are actually pretty cool, and they don't take away from the gameplay either. The gameplay itself isn't really that special, and there isn't really that much going on besides the design, but it's still bearable and doesn't feel too rushed or too bland, which is always nice. It's a decently enjoyable steeple. The only problem with it is that it's really short, and it's so easy to forget this one after playing due to lack of anything notable happening within it. This tower is one of those that is just okay and only really does the job it needs to do and nothing else, which can make it come across as pretty filler, which is essentially what this tower is. It's designed pretty well actually, progression is all over the place and that keeps this tower pretty interesting to be honest. The snake theme is also quite a cool one and can create some pretty decent gameplay throughout. The tower also has gameplay that's alright, there isn't really that much going for it and it feels a bit boring at some points, especially that floor with all the buttons on it, it just gets a little repetitive. Although it is somewhat enjoyable, and despite the fact that it feels long and very filler, it doesn't actually do a whole lot that's bad either, so at the end of the day it's just kind of mid and in C tier. This tower is quite well liked by the community, and sure it's not awful, but it isn't really that good either. I could tell this was an experimental time for the creators and they wanted to push the limits, but it negatively affected how this tower plays to be honest. It's quite creative in terms of being the first tower to toy around with things like glitches and things like trust gameplay, which is really cool, but the enjoyment and the gameplay factor is just not there because it feels like this tower's unplayable in a lot of places. And the floor rate spinner outside is really strangely made and can be skipped as well. It's just crafted so odd that it creates questionable gameplay. Also, the maze sucks, healing is not my idea of fun, the tower's just not very enjoyable in my opinion, and it doesn't play as well as the others do. I don't really get what the whole idea was for this tower, and to be honest with you, it feels a little messy to play through and doesn't really make for a good time for me. I didn't enjoy this one very much. The design is okay, the tower toys around with a lot of gimmicks, and while some of them work, a lot of them don't, and it can be quite awkward to go through without the use of a guide. And also the last few floors are ridiculously dark. I mean, why did they do this? It just makes the tower kind of unplayable and totally ruins the experience. It's enjoyable enough, I guess. There isn't really that much notable the tower does, and a few times can be a little bit sloppy. It just isn't my idea of a really good time, and Zone 6 has so much better to offer than this. The new Sobro is much better than the old one, and I'd take this over the old version any day without hesitation, but it is a little bit flawed still, and it feels like they could still do a lot more with this one than they had done. The routing is a little off, and the steeple, though more creative now and utilises better mechanics, is now a lot longer, and that can make it drag on and be much more boring and unfun to play. And yeah, it's worse than it had been previously in terms of like dragging on. They also kind of buffed up the difficulty. It's now way harder and even includes a trust flick for some reason. That's really strange of them to do that, but doesn't really affect the more experienced people, I guess. Either way, this Steeple's a lot better now and a lot more enjoyable, but there are still problems that lie within it that do kind of need to be addressed. I might not be popular for putting this down here, but I personally think this steeple is really unfun and the gameplay can be really boring to play through, despite how interesting of a theme it is. It's really creative, sure, the whole theme of a golf course is genius, and the steeple is probably one of the most unique in the entire game, purely due to the playstyle and concept, and that's got to be worth something. However, I just can't really enjoy the gameplay like I do with the theme. It's just so boring and unsight readable at points, and I genuinely find it painful to play at some parts because of how annoying it is to control. Also, it just drags on for so long. It's a really painful experience for me, which I can only really enjoy the idea of, rather than the actual steeple itself. Another steeple in Arcane area that would have been fine without the revamp, but here we are. It was never really ever that bad, it was just slightly annoying when they implemented the ice gameplay. The steeple was genuinely fun at some points, and while it was simplistic, it was actually a breath of fresh air and was one of the only Arcane area steeples that was actually sight readable and didn't make you feel pissed off because you didn't know what you were doing. Sure, the gameplay was primitive and a lot of jumps were really clunky and unfun to play, but the steeple was actually an okay one, and of course, it had flaws, but they weren't major and the overall experience was just kind of average in my opinion. I think this one kind of follows the ground to space theme. Either way, it's actually got some interesting elements to it, and the experience is better than I expected it was going to be. The tower's designed really well, it actually leans into the decoration a bit more, and it looks a bit more appealing than towers that came before it, and actually utilises its theme within the gameplay, which is pretty cool. I don't however appreciate how the gameplay can be a little basic and a lot of jumps do feel filler, and that they lack any depth or direction to them. Because of this, the tower can feel a bit forgettable at some points, but however, it's surprisingly enjoyable for a medium and is actually a good introduction to Ring 5, so I guess it has that going for it. So once again, they revamped a tower, yet it still has a few problems that need to be discussed. This is one of those towers which is kind of a mess of a lot of things mashed together, which can be kind of rough. One thing I will say is that it was very true to the original version. It included a lot of aspects the previous one had and expanded upon them well. However, it is still just full of a bunch of traps and it can still be really unfun to play, despite having had a lot of improvements to it that are supposed to have changed it for the better. The experience is much more enjoyable now, but the tower still suffers from a lot of things that made the original so horrible to play through, and I think it could still do with a few improvements to it. I thought this tower was really unique, and despite having a few shortcomings, it really wasn't that bad to be honest. It also has one of the strangest stories that isn't really that coherent. The theme is really creative, I like the whole aesthetic of the tower, and while it plays a little rough, the gameplay flows well for the most part and can be quite fun at certain parts. However, it is really loop faily, and that is an issue that doesn't seem to resolve itself even when you go further through the tower. It can be unfun to play, and the gameplay can be a little frustrating, and the tower does end up losing its enjoyability in a lot of places, which is why it kind of sits here in the lower C tier, to be fair. It's such a mixed experience. A little similar to Collective Collaboration, this one has a lot of different gameplay styles that don't really flow well together, and the steeple feels a bit messy because of this specifically. It's quite creative, the different themes are interesting, and the wacky atmosphere of the steeple can feel really cool at some parts, but they do sometimes make this quite unsight readable. The steeple has okay gameplay, some of it is janky and a lot of it is filler and feels a bit unnecessary in a lot of sections, but this doesn't tarnish the enjoyability too much. It just ruins the overall experience for some people because of the fact that it doesn't appear to have a sense of direction to it. It's a messy steeple, and to be honest, revamping it wouldn't hurt. The final outside also stings to fail on. I tried to like the steeple more, but it's honestly just really boring and I can't help but feel like the gameplay is really slow paced and I don't like the darkness aspect of this steeple. It just isn't very fun to play and it can make the whole steeple feel really unsight readable, which isn't pleasant to experience, especially when you're already bored. It doesn't really have an overall theme to it, and the snow part at the end is so out of place it just makes you question why they put it there. That said, the steeple is still really well made and a lot of the jumps, although boring, are good examples of what was possible from this steeple, and it showed that it had potential, just that it didn't really execute anything that well for what it could do. Staying in the good old garden, we visit this steeple, which is another one that I just don't find all that enjoyable. I like the theme, the steeple is short and sweet, and it contains a lot of unique mechanics that are very satisfying to play through, but there just isn't much going on and it can be really boring, especially in those acid floors, floors 3 and 4, which can be quite painful for beginners to play. The gameplay is good though, it doesn't really do anything amazing to stand out, but I guess it kind of works. It's a decent short steeple with not much to it and can feel a little underwhelming at some points, but it still plays fine and is somewhat decent to go through, so I guess it has something positive about it. I actually wonder if anyone took the advice of this steeple's name, because some of the gameplay would definitely make that a good idea, to be fair. This steeple is a pretty generic one that just kind of exists in my opinion. There are a lot of jumps that feel a bit too classic and can be a bit clunky to go through if you aren't being careful. The ice on the last floor is kind of the most interesting thing about this generic steeple. It's not really got that much going for it, and it just serves as a little short challenge for the more beginner skill level. I will say though that it is pretty enjoyable, and despite being a pretty forgettable steeple, it does have some parts that are quite entertaining for what it is. So it's not a terrible one at all if we're being real, it's just, you know, a bit mid. A really overhated tower, I believe that this one is an extremely mixed bag of positive and negative, but it does not deserve the hate that it gets considering the good stuff it did as well. For one thing, it was the first canon tower ever made to include a form of a boss fight, which in my opinion is really cool, and although it's really not that much by today's standards, it's nice that they have it. The ice gameplay is pretty annoying, and that outside later in the tower is absolutely horribly nasty due to how cruel it is to the player. The main gripe people have is the ice gameplay. It takes a lot to get used to, and this tower is pretty harsh with how it uses it, but I also believe this one is still really cool and deserves better than what the community give it. Honestly, this tower just didn't impress me much, and I don't get really why people love it. The tower isn't really well made and can suffer a lot from bad gameplay. The jumps are really inconsistent and can spike a lot for no apparent reason, and the creative theme of this tower cannot save this in my opinion, despite there being a lot of interesting themes that do definitely improve my opinion of this tower a little bit. The client objects are just used so weirdly, and because of this it just isn't enjoyable since nothing really works in the way you would expect it to, and you have to really put in the time to learn everything, which can be really annoying and destroy your motivation while trying to grind and beat this tower. I always get this one and Cliffside Falls mixed up with each other for some reason. This one's definitely the worst of the two though, and the gameplay is admittedly really bad. The only saving grace of this steeple is the design and the atmosphere. For some reason it makes everything feel really chill despite this steeple being literally anything but. The jumps in this tower are really inconsistent and so janky at points, and it makes the steeple really unfun, especially when you're loot failing it constantly. I will say that the ideas it has are pretty cool though, and once you get used to the experience, it does improve. However, the flaws this steeple has are definitely a reason to rank it in this tier, rather than anything higher, like, you know, it just deserves C tier in my opinion. Yeah, this tower's just so boring for me. It's quite well made and the quality is better than a lot of other more classic towers, but so much of this tower feels like pure filler and it just drags on way longer than it needs to, which is unnecessary because it's a medium with relatively monotonous gameplay that doesn't really do a whole lot interesting. It's not bad and it tries a lot to make the classic gameplay a bit more better than it should be, but it definitely has a lot of setbacks in terms of how bland and basic the gameplay is and how there is just too much of it to still be a good time. It's also pretty forgettable at the end of the day, and there are a lot better towers out there that are this difficulty and do a much better job than this one at staying engaging. This tower is much better than it ever has been, and the gameplay is just so much more playable now, which is awesome. However, it is a pretty mid tower and it still doesn't really do anything all that interesting. It's decently creative with how it takes some of the old elements of Tower of Madness and expands upon them to create something that is a lot more interesting than the previous version, but doesn't hesitate to remove some of the stuff that made the old version bad. Like floor 5 spam jumps or the completely obvious walking simulator at the end. They put actual gameplay there, and they make it much better to play than it ever was, which is all that you could ask for from a revamp, but it feels a little boring still, and there's still some stuff that's just not great. This tower is a really well made one, but it is just uninteresting and in my opinion quite bland if I had to call it something. It has some decent gameplay here and there, the ideas are good, and for a Ascension tower it does what it needs to, but it just struggles to remain that interesting throughout and can feel really unengaging, especially in the middle floors. It's kind of loop faily at the end too, due to the gameplay becoming a little bit more finicky as you progress further through, which does make the tower slightly unenjoyable. It's generic, it's fine, there's not a whole lot to say other than it's just okay and doesn't really do much else other than be a hard Ascension tower, which I guess makes it somewhat good and somewhat bad at the same time. Here we are at what is widely considered the easiest SC. This tower is a little bit of a mixed bag in my opinion and has a few problems that make it unenjoyable, yet also some positives that make it a good experience and a great one to grind as your first SC. However, sides B and C can make this a really tedious tower, and the gameplay is really difficult in terms of sometimes being a bit unsight-readable in terms of routing. Like, what is even going on most of the time? The tower can't decide if it's rem or insane. The jumps are fairly straightforward, and some of them are pretty enjoyable to try and practice, but some of them are inconsistent, and can be quite painful to play if you're not prepared. Also, the tower is kind of loop faily. A mixed experience if you ask me. Genuinely, who even remembers this tower? Well, I'm going to try my best to rank it. The tower's gameplay is pretty decent for the most part. Some of it's unsight readable, but after a few moments you get the hang of the general idea of this tower pretty quickly. It can be kind of boring, you don't really do a lot of destroying stuff, you kind of just walk through blocks or smash through them, you know, despite what's in the name. And it's just really forgettable and doesn't really do a lot that's interesting, and for Zone 7 it's kind of on the weaker side. It can also be a little bit janky at some points due to the nature of the client objects, but for the most part they're okay, and it's really just a matter of playing the tower safe. It's a tower which honestly is really forgettable and isn't that interesting, but isn't that bad either. While for the most part this Steeple is basically your average modern day gameplay and there isn't all that much going on, you can admit that it does have a pretty funny story and it has a certain charm about it. The boss fighting was kind of annoying in my opinion, and I felt like it was way too hard to be honest, and some of the gameplay is a little unsight readable and can be annoying, but it isn't all too bad. It can be quite a repetitive Steeple, and it is one that requires a lot more patience than the average tower, but it does feel quite rewarding to beat and is a fun one if you're willing to sit through some pretty repetitive stuff. I don't really think it's anything other than middle C tier ground for me, so here it is. So yeah, I've come to the decision to place this video into multiple parts. It will be 3 parts. This is the first one. There's 150 towers on each part. So yeah, I've got a lot to do. I think it's just easier to do this because, you know, it feels like I'm doing a lot every day and it is quite tiring for me. So splitting it into these parts and having myself do this in little waves is a bit better for me, I think. Yeah, I know the community poll voted for one big video, but there were still quite a lot of people that did want this to be, you know, multiple parts, so this is what it's going to be. Thank you for watching. Please like and please subscribe for my own sanity, because goodness me, this has been a massive project that has, you know, it's really required a lot of my focus and attention and a lot of my effort, so please like and subscribe, and yeah, I'll continue to make this and I'll get the next 2 parts out as soon as I can. I reckon it'll take like maybe a week or 2 for the next part, and then another week or 2 for the third part. Yeah, it'll be good fun. So yeah, thanks for watching. Please like, please subscribe. Goodbye.